now it's gonna be louder. So the motivation for this piece is there is several-fold. First of all, the Central Eastern European countries in general have the minimum wages defined at the national level, and in theory the minimum wages in these countries should cover all workers, at least in the formal sector. As probably you know, it's not always the case in Europe and in other countries. Even in Europe, several economies have minimum wages which are defined only for particular sectors or are defined only for particular occupations. Here in Central Eastern Europe, it's different. We have it at the national level. What is also interesting that in several countries there exists several levels of the minimum wage. For example, in Hungary or Czech Republic or Slovakia, there is like a basic minimum wage, and then for specific occupational groups, the minimum wage level is higher. However, at the way this extra higher minimum wage level, the subminimal, let's say, are defined, is far from being clear and concise. In that sense, they are not defined by occupation. They are more like suggestions for particular types of workers, rather than something which is binding and enforced. Because of that, we are actually focusing in all of the countries on this basic minimum wage level, because our focus is on, let's say, on low-paid or underpaid workers. At the same time, something which characterizes the minimum wage policy is that there is a lack of clear enforcement policy or clearly defined institutions which should take care of enforcing the minimum wage regulation. When we talk about the labor laws, the labor codes, it's more or less clear, but when it comes to minimum wage policy, it is not clear how actually the government can impose the policy on companies and workers. Moreover, the debate on minimum wage is probably one of the most ideological when it comes to labor regulations. There is a very nice experiment I've seen recently when the results of, let's say, hypothetical fake treatment study were shown to the group of researchers dealing with development. And to some of them, they were presented as a test of face cream efficiency. To some of them, they were presented as a test of minimum wage. And it was very clear that the fraction of people who identified that basically the test showed no impact was much higher when it was sold as face cream rather than at the minimum wage. With the minimum wage, definitely the lower fraction of researchers identified that it's basically no impact there. And finally, the literature on the minimum wage has obsession on employment effects. I guess around 85% of all the papers published focus on employment effects, and probably around 80% of them found no employment effects. The research on other aspects, how the minimum wage impacts inequality, how minimum wage impacts productivity, and so on and so forth, is much more limited. So we sort of try to ignore the employment effects and focus what happens, how efficient the minimum wage policy is in actually addressing the low pay, and try to analyze what kind of what's the picture in the region where it comes to violating or not subscribing to the minimum wage requirements. Something which is really important, I think, to frame the discussion is that over the last 10 years, the minimum wage across the region has increased a lot. The pace of this change was very different. In some countries like Czech Republic, Hungary, Lithuania, the growth of minimum wage in real terms was not that high. In Czech Republic, that was basically flat, and there is currently a very heated debate about increasing minimum wage, probably not based on any kind of research. But on the other hand, in countries like Latvia, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, the minimum wage increased by half or even more in real terms over the last 10 years. At the same time, we see that in most of the countries of the region, the minimum wage has increased more than the average wage or the median wage. So the so-called Kites ratio, Kites index in 2013 was in most of the countries of our region was actually higher than it was in 2003. What is also important is that although in general the Kites index in our region is lower than it is in Western Europe, the tendency is different. In most of the EU 15 countries, minimum wages have declined relatively to the wage distribution, as you can see here. But in most of our countries, plus the UK, of course, but the UK didn't really have a minimum wage before 1999, they increased. So these trends are slightly different. We can say that we are converging in a way. So what we do in this paper is we look at the three measures of minimum wage violation that were proposed by Ben and Ben Boss and his co-authors a couple of years ago. Those of you who participated last year, Harun Borat was presenting a research on minimum wage last year. And these measures of violation, there are threefold. First of all, it's incidence of violation. So it's basically a fraction of workers who are paid less than the minimum wage. And it's defined at the individual level simply as a dummy, and then overall it's just a fraction of workers who are underpaid. Then we analyze also the depth of violation. The depth of violation is defined as the gap to the minimum wage of the gap between the individual wage and the minimum wage in parallel to how we define the poverty gaps, for example, how much income is the household lacks to escape poverty. And then the overall measure, which I will focus on, is defined as the average depth of violation per worker. And then we also analyze the average shortfall, which is the average depth, but only per violated worker. So just the denominator is different here. The data that we use is the EU Silk data, basically the whole set that is available. So it comprises the 2003 or 4 the period 2003/4 until 2013. And the choice of EU Silk is rather determined, let's say, in a negative way, in that sense that we can't really use the EU LFS data because the information on wages is lacking. We don't really want to use the structure of earnings survey because they comprise only of companies 9 workers plus and only of labor code-based contracts. So actually when we analyze the minimum wage, we actually lose an important fraction of companies which do pay minimum wage or low wages. So we focus on the EU Silk data, but because of the data issues in the EU Silk, we have to focus our study to the workers who are full-time workers and they work for the entire year. So we don't analyze people who have like breaks between employment and unemployment. These are data issues, we can discuss it later. So I guess you can think about the findings that we have as a sort of like a lower band of violation estimates, because I would imagine that people who have breaks and rotate between unemployment and employment are more likely to be underpaid. What is actually the scope of the non-compliance or violation of the minimum wages in the countries? These are the averages for the 2003-2012 period. And as you can see, they vary somehow, let's say. On the average, the highest non-violation, so the fraction of the workers, full-time workers working constantly who were paid less than the minimum wage was highest in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, also in Hungary. It was much lower in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Estonia. However, we find that over time, when we divide the period of our analysis into pre-crisis, first wave of the crisis, and the second wave of the crisis period, there are three trends that we identify. First, it's Poland, Latvia, Slovenia. This clearly increasing violation. So the fraction of workers paid below the minimum wage has increased over the last 10 years. For Poland, that was from like 3% into about 6% over the last 10 years. The other group of countries are those where it decreased. It's mainly Czech Republic, when the violation was substantial, 2003, 2007. However, it declined by half. I mean, it was not that substantial, it's 0.02, but it declined. The same with Estonia and Hungary. The levels were higher 10 years ago, but they have declined. And the third group of countries, it's Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia. Then the violation actually increased in the first stage of the crisis, and then it declined again. So it's actually currently in Slovakia, we find it similar to how it was before the crisis, but there was this temporary spike struck. On this graph, we identify, using this 3-year-long period, that there is some positive relationship between the incidence of violation of the minimum wage and the KITES index across in the cross-section of the countries and also over the time. So you can see that the countries actually clustered themselves like in the two groups here, but in general there is this positive relationship that the higher the KITES index, the higher is the minimum wage, the incidence of violation. However, that effect is actually explained or related to what is happening within countries over time rather than to differences between countries. So when we run simple between effects and fixed effects regressions using the data set of annual data that we have, we find that between effects, so something that should explain differences in the violation level between countries, is actually insignificant. So you can't really explain the higher violation in Latvia, Lithuania in comparison to Estonia with the KITES index. That has to be some taste for violating rather than the difference in KITES. However, you can explain, or you can correlate, let's say, the evolution of incidence of violation within countries to what is happening to KITES index, and the relationship is positive. So the countries which do increase the KITES index, they happen to have higher violation afterwards. The other cross-country pattern that we identify is that the higher the incidence of violation is, actually the lower the average shortfall is. So the countries where the non-compliance is most common, on the average the gap of wage of those violated workers, the wage gap of these violated workers vis-a-vis the minimum wage level tends to be slightly lower. And again, we run the panel regression to see how that relates to the between country and within country effect. And again, we find that that relationship, that the higher the number of violated workers, the lower the average gap they have vis-a-vis the minimum wage, can be really explained by the differences between countries. It is explained or related to what is happening within countries. So as the incidence of violation rises, we find that the average gap is actually lower. So that can be interpreted as some kind of pattern when sort of, maybe it's the case that once the KITES index increases and the minimum wage increases, some of the workers they stay at the wage level that they have. There is no adjustment, but actually they fell a little bit shorter out from the minimum wage level than the workers who were violated before. However, it is possible that there might be some additional type of violation, and it could be violation by hours. We can imagine the situation where workers are paid the minimum wage level, but they work extra hours, so their hourly wage is actually below. Or we can imagine a situation when they have, let's say, part-time job, which pays them a little bit less than the full-time minimum wage equivalent, but they work full-time. In our case, because we focus on the full-time workers, it's actually the case when companies sort of violate with extra hours. And we find that even though so now we decompose the entire violation incidence into two components. One component, there are workers violated in monthly and hourly terms. So these are people who work full-time and they are paid less than the monthly minimum wage, which means that they are paid less than the hourly minimum wage as well. And we also distinguish workers who are paid at least the monthly minimum wage, but they work so many extra hours that our hourly minimum wage is actually less than the hourly equivalent of the minimum wage. And you can see that the fraction of the ranking changes. So when we account for this type of violation, Poland turns out to be the country with the highest violation. So it's sort of Polish employers are really smart in that sense. That's the finding. Actually, Poland, Hungary, Romania stand as a countries where this hour violation by hours is is the highest phenomenon. At the same time, you can see that it is sort of like the additional way of taking advantage of the worker, not the basic way. Most of the violated workers are violated in monthly terms. So another look that we have on the violation is to see what's the interplay between the violation of the minimum wage and the types of contracts, in particular temporary contracts. And you can see that in all of the countries, the incidence of violation is much higher for temporary workers. These are the red bars. And the difference between the red bars and the gray bars is substantial for every country. There are two caveats here, however. The first caveat is that the average shortfall is not really different. So the wage gap for temporary and permanent workers tends to be very similar for both types of workers. And also, you should pay your attention to the fact that except for Poland and Hungary, actually, the fact that the temporary workers have much higher incidence of violation doesn't really translate into total violation, except for Poland, because the fraction of temporary workers is generally low in the other countries. So even though, let's say, look at Estonia, the violation among temporary workers is much higher than permanent, it barely affects the total violation incidence because they are just a tiny group. Poland is the only country when the difference between total incidence and the temporary worker incidence is substantial. So the last quantitative exercise we do is to try to look at the individual data and run some regressions at using the microdata that we have, a probit regression to just identify what are the socioeconomic characteristics which correlate well with the fact of being violated. And actually, the findings that we have is that these are the results of the pooled regressions of all the countries. We also, in the paper, we will also have, we already have, but the paper is not ready yet. So in the paper, we'll also present the regressions country by country, which in general differ slightly between themselves only in the, let's say, the power of the size of the estimates, not really in the what's significant and what's not. So basically, the regressions here show that being violated in terms of minimum wage is a sort of like a way of being a low-paid worker. The characteristics that correlate very well significantly correlate with the fact of being underpaid or violated in the minimum wage terms. These are basically low skills. These are basically low skills as higher education level allow workers reduce the probability of violation. They are also related to having like a simple elementary occupations, right, doing simple jobs. They are of course higher in agriculture, construction, market services than in industry. Non-market services, which are often public sector, have lower probabilities. They're also much higher for the temporary workers and much higher for females. And what is striking here is that the difference in the risk of being violated between low-skilled males on temporary jobs and low-skilled women on permanent jobs is actually very similar. So I think that we find that this is actually quite substantial finding for females that is as important as getting a temporary contract to have a higher risk of minimum wage violation. And just to sum up, we find that the minimum wage violation in Central and Eastern European countries is quite diversified. It also evolved differently over time. Countries which increased Kait's index, so minimum wage relative to the average wage over the last 10 years, they experienced higher violation. However, the higher violation didn't really translate into more powerful violation of the minimum wage. To the contrary, the depth of violation, the average shortfall, actually tended to be lower in the countries with higher incidence or increasing Kait's indices and increasing incidence of violation. Violation of hours is a sort of like additional way of not binding the minimum wage regulations, but it's not that pronounced as a let's say, full-fledged violation in terms of monthly wages. And we also find that the individual characteristics are more or less typical for the low-paid workers. So this is sort of like a specific kind of low pay rather than a very different phenomenon. Although some signs of segmentation related to temporary jobs, they do emerge. Thank you very much for your attention. I would
Okay.